Van Johnson was the dream lover of millions of American girls in the 1940s. But Hollywood whispered a fatal secret. He had no interest in women. He displayed soft mannerisms and was unusually attached to actor Keenan Wynn. To prevent a box office disaster, Louis B. Mayer, the tycoon of MGM, issued a shocking directive: force Keenan to divorce his wife and force Van Johnson to marry that very same woman within hours. It was a staged wife robbery, carefully orchestrated to cover up the top star's true sexuality. Before the world knew him as the golden boy with the $1 million smile, he was just Charles Vandell Johnson, a lonely child in Newport, Rhode Island, living with a gaping hole in his heart. His mother abandoned him when he was a toddler, leaving him in the care of a cold, alcoholic father who rarely offered a kind word, let alone an embrace. Van grew up starving for affection, terrified of rejection, and harboring a secret that could destroy him in the 1930s. He was a gay man living in a world that demanded traditional masculinity. He learned early on that his dazzling smile was a shield, a way to deflect scrutiny and beg for the love he never received at home. But a shield is not a home, and Van spent his early adulthood drifting, desperately searching for an anchor. He found that anchor in the home of Keenan and Evie Wynn. Keenan was everything Van was not. The son of comedy legend Ed Wynn, he was loud, aggressively masculine, and unapologetically confident. Van idolized him, studying Keenan's mannerisms in hopes of absorbing some of that strength. Then there was Evie, sharp, ambitious, and pragmatic. Evie was the matriarch Van had always craved. Far more than a housewife, she operated as a manager of lives. When Van entered their orbit, he was like a stray animal seeking warmth. He clung to Keenan for identity and to Evie for safety, and for a while, they were just close friends navigating Hollywood. But a catastrophe was coming that would fuse their lives together permanently. On March 31st, 1943, the dynamic shifted from friendship to absolute dependency. Van was driving his convertible to the studio when he was struck head-on by a car running a red light. The impact was horrific. Van was thrown through the windshield, his scalp nearly severed, and his skull fractured on the pavement of Venice Boulevard. As he lay bleeding on the asphalt, touching the exposed bone of his own skull, the invincible facade of the rising star was shattered. He survived, but he was broken, classified as 4F, and unfit for military service. While he lay in the hospital, terrified that his disfigured face would end his career, it was Keenan and Evie who sat by his bedside. When Van was finally discharged, he didn't return to an empty apartment. He moved into the Wynn's home, and he simply never left. Evie took charge of his recovery with an intensity that went beyond friendship. She bathed him, fed him, and managed his insecurities, while Keenan accepted Van's constant presence as the price of being close to a rising superstar. A strange symbiotic triangle formed in that house on Copa de Oro Road. Van provided the glamour and the money, Evie provided the structure, and Keenan provided the masculine cover. They told themselves they were a modern, chosen family, safe within the walls of their private sanctuary. But outside those walls, Van Johnson was becoming the biggest star in the world, and the spotlight was about to turn their comfortable arrangement into a very dangerous trap. By 1945, Van Johnson had transcended mere celebrity to become a massive industrial asset and a national obsession. Unlike the fragmented fame of the modern internet age, this was the era of the monoculture, where the entire nation watched the same screens, read the same magazines, and worshiped the same idols. And in the vacuum left by the leading men who had gone to fight in World War II, Clark Gable, James Stewart, Tyrone Power, Van Johnson filled the void, with a force that MGM had never anticipated. They called it Vandemonium, a term coined to describe a hysteria that presaged the Beatles by nearly 20 years. It was a visceral, physical reaction that swept through the female population of America. When Van appeared in public, traffic stopped. In Chicago, when he tried to board a train, a mob of 4,000 teenage girls, the Bobby Soxers, broke through the police cordon, tearing at his clothes, ripping the buttons from his jacket, and trying to secure a lock of his red hair as a holy relic. He was forced to flee for his life, escaping onto the roof of the train while the crowd below shrieked his name with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy. To the American public, he was the boy next door perfected. He was the non-threatening, freckle-faced, sweet-natured alternative to the brooding lovers of the past. He was the guy who would carry your books home, the guy who would drink a malted milkshake with you, the guy who represented the very innocence that the war was supposedly being fought to preserve. MGM marketing capitalized on his 4F status, his medical exemption from the draft due to his metal-plated skull, by painting him as the home front hero, the one who kept the heart of America beating while the others were away. He was the swoon heart. But the irony of this image was so sharp it could draw blood. The man who represented the ultimate heterosexual fantasy for millions of women was, in his private reality, navigating a labyrinth of terror regarding his own identity. The higher his star rose, the deeper the shadow it cast. Every magazine cover that proclaimed him the ideal husband was another brick in the wall of a prison that was slowly closing in around him. Inside the sprawling Spanish-style mansion on Copa de Oro Road in Bel Air, the three-legged stool of the Wynn Johnson household was beginning to wobble under the immense pressure of this fame. The communal living arrangement, which had begun as a necessity for recovery and deepened into a convenient friendship, was now morphing into something far more complex and claustrophobic. To the outside world, they were the Three Musketeers, an inseparable trio of best friends. But inside the house, the dynamics were shifting into a tense negotiation of power, jealousy, and fear. Keenan Wynn, once the dominant alpha male who had taken the wounded Van under his wing, now found himself eclipsed in his own home. He was no longer just Keenan Wynn, the respected character actor. He was Van Johnson's best friend. He watched as the studio executives, who used to barely acknowledge him, now treated him with deference, solely because he held the keys to their most valuable property. Keenan's masculinity was being eroded by the sheer wattage of Van's stardom. He became the court jester in the kingdom of Van Johnson, a role that bred a quiet, corrosive resentment. Yet, he could not ask Van to leave. The luxury they lived in, the parties they attended, the social gravity they possessed, it was all generated by Van's presence. Keenan was trapped by the very success he envied. While Keenan was paralyzed by envy, Evie Wynn was galvanized by purpose. She had realized early on that Van Johnson was incapable of managing his own existence. He was a man-child in the truest sense, emotionally stunted, terrified of conflict, and perpetually seeking approval. Evie stepped into the vacuum of authority. She began to run the house not just as a home, but as a fortress designed to protect the Van Johnson brand. She managed the schedules, she screened the calls, and she filtered the guests. She was the gatekeeper. But the gatekeeper was becoming increasingly aware that the barbarian was already inside the gate. The danger to Van Johnson didn't come from rival actors or bad reviews. It came from his own desires. The mid-1940s in Hollywood was a time of schizophrenic morality. On screen, the production code enforced a rigid, sanitized version of life. Off screen, the industry was fueled by vice. However, there was a hierarchy of sin. Adultery was a scandal, but it was survivable. It could even add a dash of rogue charm to a leading man. Alcoholism was a tragedy, but it was tolerated. Homosexuality, however, was a death sentence. It was not just a career ender, it was a felony. This was the dawn of the Lavender Scare, a parallel paranoia to the anti-communist Red Scare. The police and the government viewed homosexuals as security risks and moral deviants. In Los Angeles, the Vice Squad aggressively raided gay bars, entrapment was common, and the names of those arrested were promptly fed to the press to destroy them. Van Johnson was not a monk. He was a young man with needs, living in a city that offered every temptation. Despite the protective cocoon Evie tried to weave around him, Van would take risks. There were nights when the pressure of being the swoon heart became too suffocating, and he would slip away. He would disappear into the shadowy corners of Los Angeles, to the underground bars on Main Street, or private gatherings in the Hollywood Hills, where the mask could slip, if only for a few hours. These disappearances were the stuff of nightmares for Evie Wynn and the studio. Each time Van walked out the door alone, he was carrying the GDP of a small nation on his back. If he were caught in a raid, or if he were seen with the wrong person, the boy next door illusion would shatter instantly. The studio had a cleanup crew for this exact reason, led by the legendary and ruthless Howard Strickling, the head of publicity for MGM. Strickling was the dark wizard of Hollywood. His job was strictly to manufacture a palatable reality regardless of the truth. He had spies everywhere, in the police department, in the hospitals, in the hotels. When a star got into trouble, Strickling was often called before the police were. He could make drunk driving accidents disappear, he could erase unwanted pregnancies, and he could bury arrest records. But even Strickling couldn't stop the whispers. The whispers were beginning to turn into a roar. The gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, were the self-appointed moral guardians of the industry. They wielded power that rivaled the studio heads. Hedda Hopper, in particular, had a nose for blood. She looked at the arrangement at the Wynn house, a handsome unmarried superstar living with a married couple, and she didn't see a quirky friendship. She saw a cover-up. She began to drop blind items in her columns, short, vague paragraphs that didn't name names but gave enough clues for the savvy reader to decode. She questioned why the idol of the Bobby Soxers hadn't found a girl of his own. She made snide remarks about Van's bachelorhood. These were warning shots. The message was clear. We know. And if you don't fix this, we will destroy you. Inside the house, the tension became palpable. The carefree breakfasts were replaced by silent, anxious readings of the morning papers. Evie watched Van with the eyes of a hawk. Every time he looked at a man a little too long, every time his mannerisms became a little too soft, she would correct him. She began to police his body language. Stand up straight. Don't hold your cigarette like that. Lower your voice. She was directing his performance in his own living room. Van, for his part, retreated further into his shell. He drank to numb the anxiety. The happy-go-lucky boy on the billboards was, in reality, a man vibrating with terror. He knew that everything he had, the money, the adulation, the love of the world, was built on a lie that was becoming impossible to sustain. He was a fraud, and he lived with the constant crushing fear of being unmasked. The crisis reached a boiling point in late 1946. It wasn't one single event, but an accumulation of near misses. There were rumors of an arrest that had been narrowly avoided. There were stories circulating about Van's association with certain undesirable elements in the industry. The studio sensed that the dam was about to break. Strickling went to Louis B. Mayer, the emperor of MGM, and delivered the bad news. The Van Johnson product was defective, and the defect was about to be exposed. Mayer, a man who believed he owned the souls of his actors, just as he owned the celluloid they were printed on, did not panic. He looked at the problem with the cold, calculating eyes of a businessman facing a supply chain disruption. He needed to fix the asset. He needed to package Van Johnson in a way that made him bulletproof. And looking at the dossier, Mayer saw the solution right there in Van's living room. The solution was the wife of his best friend. Evie Wynn was perfect. She was already in the picture. The public accepted her presence. She was strong, she was loyal to the industry, and she was capable of controlling Van. If Van married Evie, the weirdness of their living situation would instantly be retrofitted into a romantic narrative. The Three's a Crowd problem would be solved by removing Keenan from the equation, but this required an act of emotional cannibalism. It required Keenan to be discarded and Evie to be reassigned. For Louis B. Mayer, this was a simple script rewrite, entirely devoid of any moral dilemma. The pressure on the trio began to manifest in grotesque ways. Keenan, sensing the walls closing in, became more erratic, his humor more biting. He knew on some level that he was the obstacle in the narrative of Van's salvation. Evie became colder, more calculating. She saw the inevitable conclusion approaching, and she began to steel herself for the role of a lifetime. And Van just waited to be told what to do. The shadow behind the flashbulbs had grown so long that it had swallowed the sun. The boy next door was trapped in a noir thriller, and the final act was about to be written not by fate, but by corporate decree. The happy days at Copa de Oro were over. The era of the transaction was about to begin. The disintegration of their shared reality did not begin with a scream or a violent confrontation, but with the terrifying banality of a telephone ringing in the hallway of the house on Copa de Oro Road. In the high-stakes, paranoid ecosystem of Metro Goldwyn Mayer in late 1946, the telephone was the primary instrument of terror, a direct umbilical cord connecting the vengeful gods on the executive floor to the mortal contract players living in the sprawling flatlands of Los Angeles. When the call came, the air inside the Wynn Johnson household, already thick with the humidity of unspoken secrets and the stale smoke of anxious cigarettes, seemed to freeze. The voice on the other end, likely a secretary whose tone was professional, detached, and utterly non-negotiable, delivered the summons that every actor in Culver City dreaded in the marrow of their bones. Mr. Mayer wanted to see them, and the terrifying specificity of the request was that he did not want to see just Van, the star, nor just Keenan, the employee. He demanded the presence of all three, a collective summons that signaled the studio was no longer dealing with a career management issue, but with a crisis that threatened the foundational assets of the corporation. The visceral dread invoked by this summons is impossible to grasp through the lens of a modern corporation. In the Golden Age, Louis B. Mayer did not merely run a company, he ruled a sovereign state. His office, located in the imposing Thalberg building, often referred to by the cynical contract players as the Iron Lung, was the inner sanctum of the American Dream Factory, a place where destinies were written, rewritten, and erased with the stroke of a pen. Entering his office was a ritual of submission, a pilgrimage to the altar of a deity who viewed his actors not as employees with rights, but as livestock to be managed, children to be disciplined, or valuable racehorses that required breaking. As Van, Keenan, and Evie drove from the sanctuary of Bel Air to the studio lot, passing the artificial streets and two-dimensional facades of the sound stages where they spent their working lives, they were driving into the mouth of the beast, fully aware that the rumors of Van's homosexuality, the Lavender scare, that was beginning to purge the industry of deviance, had finally breached the containment walls erected by the studio's fixers. The walk to Mayer's office was a death march through the corridors of power, leading them into the famous White Room, a space designed with immense psychological calculation to intimidate and diminish anyone who entered. The office was vast, carpeted in plush white wool that swallowed the sound of footsteps, forcing visitors to approach Mayer's massive fortress-like desk in absolute silence, stripping them of their confidence before a word was even spoken. Mayer sat behind this altar, a small bespectacled man who cast a shadow that covered the entire industry, a man who could weep on cue to manipulate a starlet or destroy a man's life with a phone call to the police chief. When the trio entered, the silence that greeted them was heavy with the scent of expensive tobacco and the sterile chill of air conditioning, a silence that Mayer let hang in the air like a guillotine blade, allowing their own guilt and terror to do the work of the prosecution before the trial had even begun. Mayer did not waste time with the pleasantries of a benevolent patriarch. He laid the situation out with the cold, brutal logic of a capitalist protecting a multi-million-dollar investment that was in danger of depreciating to zero. He stripped away the polite fictions that Van, Keenan, and Evie had used to comfort themselves, brutally exposing the reality that the bachelor narrative for Van Johnson was wearing thin, and that the public was beginning to ask dangerous questions about why the boy next door was living with a married couple and why he had no romantic interests of his own. Mayer explained, with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor, that the rumors were moving from the whispered corners of underground bars to the typewriters of powerful gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper, and if the dam broke, the flood would drown them all. Van would not just lose his career, he would be annihilated by the morals clauses in his contract, left penniless and pariah-like in a society that viewed his nature as a felony. And because they were inextricably linked, Keenan and Evie would be dragged down into the abyss with him, their social standing pulverized and their livelihoods extinguished by the sheer force of the scandal. Then came the solution, a proposal so cynical and devoid of human empathy that it could only have been conceived in the boardroom of a studio that manufactured emotions for a living. Mayer did not offer a suggestion. He handed them a script for the next act of their lives, a plot twist designed to reset the narrative and inoculate the Van Johnson brand against the virus of rumor. The solution was Evie. Mayer's logic was diabolical in its practicality. Evie was already in the picture. She was already the maternal figure managing Van's life, and the public was already accustomed to seeing them together. If Van were to marry a stranger, the press would dig for dirt. But if he married his best friend's wife, the studio publicity machine could spin it as a tragic, overwhelming romance, a love so powerful it transcended friendship. A scandal, yes, but a heterosexual scandal of passion, which was survivable and even profitable, unlike the scandal of deviance. The ultimatum was delivered with the finality of a death sentence. Keenan must divorce Evie immediately, and Evie must marry Van immediately, rearranging the architecture of their lives to fit the quarterly earnings report of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The psychological collapse of Keenan Wynn in that moment is a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a study in the erosion of a man's soul by the machinery of fame. Keenan was a man of pride, a third-generation actor who rode motorcycles and projected an image of rugged, masculine independence. Yet he sat there and listened as he was told to hand his wife over to another man like a piece of used property. He did not flip the desk or storm out. because he was paralyzed by the absolute terror of the blacklist. He knew that in the studio system, defying Louis B. Mayer was professional suicide that would ensure he never worked in Hollywood again, condemning his son to poverty and shaming his legendary father. But beneath the fear lay a darker, more corrosive truth that Keenan had been hiding even from himself. He knew that his marriage had been hollowed out long before they walked into that office. For years, he had watched Evie obsess over Van, mothering him, managing him, and directing her emotional energy toward the golden boy in the guest room, leaving Keenan as the third wheel in his own marriage. Agreeing to the deal was not just an act of cowardice, but a devastating admission of defeat, a realization that he had already lost his wife to the star, and the divorce was merely the administrative paperwork for an emotional betrayal that had already occurred. Evie Wynn, standing in the center of that white room, was a complex figure of ambition wrapped in the guise of a victim, her mind racing not with the horror of the proposal, but with the sudden intoxicating realization of her own potential ascension. While she was being used as a pawn, Evie was also a survivor who recognized that as Mrs. Keenan Wynn, she was merely the wife of a character actor, destined for the sidelines of Hollywood history. As Mrs. Van Johnson, however, she would be royalty, the gatekeeper to the biggest star on earth, wielding immense power over the scripts, the accounts, and the social access of the elite. She rationalized this devil's bargain by convincing herself that she was the only one strong enough to save Van, framing her ambition as a noble sacrifice for the family, a delusion that allowed her to look her husband in the eye without crumbling from shame. She told herself she was falling on a grenade to save them all, when in reality she was seizing the controls of a machine she had always wanted to pilot, accepting the role of warden because she believed she could rehabilitate the prisoner. And then there was Van Johnson, the swoon heart, the man who could command the adoration of millions with a wave of his hand, yet who stood in that office reduced to the state of a mute, terrified child. The psychology of Van Johnson was that of a man who had spent his entire life searching for parents to tell him who to be, a man terrified of his own desires and the part of himself that imperiled his fame. When Mayer spoke, Van heard the voice of the angry father he had always feared, and he lacked the internal structure to fight back. He was a vessel waiting to be filled with direction. Internalizing the command to marry Evie, Van likely felt a wave of pathetic relief wash over his panic because the decision had been taken out of his hands, sparing him the terrifying responsibility of navigating his own life. He knew that by marrying Evie, he was retreating into a fortress of respectability where he would be safe from the police and the press, even if it meant locking himself in a cage with a woman who was more of a manager than a lover. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the friend he was betraying, and nodded his assent, trading his authenticity for his security in a transaction that cost him his soul but saved his stardom. There was no negotiation, no debate, and no plea for mercy, for one did not negotiate with the gods of the studio system. One simply accepted their decrees or faced expulsion from the Garden of Eden. When they walked out of the Thalberg building, the California sun must have felt blindingly cruel, illuminating three people who were now ghosts in designer clothes, their friendship irrevocably shattered by the secret they had just agreed to keep. The drive back to Bel Air was the beginning of a profound estrangement, a journey into a new reality where every word spoken between them would be tainted by the knowledge of the transaction. That night, as the reality of the bargain settled over the house on Copadoro Road, they were three strangers waiting for the executioner. knowing that they had sold the only real thing they possessed, their truth, to buy a counterfeit life that would imprison them for the rest of their days. The machinery of MGM began to turn immediately, drafting the legal papers and booking the travel to Mexico. While Van drank to numb the shame, Evie plotted her new regime, and Keenan mourned the death of the man he used to be, all of them trapped in the amber of a decision that would define them forever. The physical journey into the heart of the conspiracy began not with a fanfare, but with the silent funereal closing of a limousine door in the pre-dawn darkness of Los Angeles on January 25th, 1947. The vehicle, a sleek black cocoon of leather and chrome provided by the studio, slid away from the curb of the Copa de Oro mansion, carrying inside it 3 passengers who were about to commit a crime against their own hearts. Van Johnson, Evie Wynn, and Keenan Wynn sat in the plush interior, separated by inches of space but divided by an ocean of unspoken betrayal, embarking on a drive that would take them from the manicured artificial paradise of Bel Air to the dusty, chaotic reality of the Mexican border. The atmosphere inside the car was suffocating, pressurized by the collective weight of the lie they had agreed to live. It was a silence so absolute and heavy that the sound of a match being struck or a breath being drawn felt like an intrusion, a silence where eye contact was carefully avoided, because to look at one another was to acknowledge the grotesquerie of what they were about to do. As the limousine cut through the sleeping suburbs and out into the open desert highway, the landscape shifted from the green, watered lawns of the rich to the stark, unforgiving scrubland, a visual metaphor for the stripping away of their illusions. They were leaving behind the world of scripts and sets where they could control the outcome and entering a raw, unpredictable jurisdiction where the only law was the transaction. Juarez, Mexico, in 1947 was the shadow city to Hollywood's light, a place where the moral strictures of American society came to be dissolved in acid for a fee. It was the divorce capital of the hemisphere, a border town industry built on the wreckage of American marriages, populated by quick-fix lawyers, notary publics, and officials who viewed the sanctity of vows through the pragmatic lens of the peso. When the limousine finally rolled into the dusty streets of Juarez, the contrast was jarring. The pristine movie stars, dressed in their bespoke suits and couture, stepping out into the heat and grit of a town that smelled of diesel, stale tobacco, and cheap bureaucracy. They were ushered quickly by studio handlers toward the municipal office, a drab, peeling building that served as the factory floor for this assembly line tragedy. The absurdity of the situation must have been nauseating. 3 best friends, who had spent years sharing meals and holidays, were now standing in a dingy hallway, waiting for a clerk to call their names so they could legally dismantle the family unit that had been the envy of their social circle. Keenan Wynn, the man who had brought Van into his home and saved him, stood with his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of stoic resignation, playing the role of the noble friend to the bitter end, while Evie stood beside him, steeling herself for the transition from wife to ex-wife to bride in the span of a single afternoon. The choreography of the legal proceedings was executed with the cold, efficient rhythm of a business merger, stripped of any spiritual or emotional weight. First, Keenan and Evie were summoned to the desk to enact the divorce, a procedure that reduced the complex 8-year history of their marriage, the birth of their son, Ned, the struggles of their early career, the intimacy of 1,000 shared nights, into a stack of paperwork stamped by a disinterested official. With the scratching of a pen, the legal entity of Keenan and Evie ceased to exist. The bonds of matrimony were severed simply because a corporation needed to protect an asset, rather than any death of love. Keenan stepped back from the desk, legally untethered, a man who had just signed away his life's partner to save his career from the blacklist. He retreated to the periphery of the room, becoming a ghost at his own funeral, watching the woman who was no longer his wife prepare to marry the man who was no longer his best friend. The humiliation of that moment, standing in a foreign country, stripping himself of his status as a husband to facilitate a cover-up, was the price of his survival in the studio system, a wound that would fester beneath his skin for the rest of his life. Then began the interlude of the damned, the agonizing window of time mandated between the divorce and the remarriage to maintain a thin veneer of legality. Then began the interlude of the damned, the agonizing window of time mandated between the divorce and the remarriage to maintain a thin veneer of legality. It was approximately 4 hours, 240 minutes of purgatory where the three of them were suspended in a void, no longer what they were, and not yet what they would become. One can only surmise the suffocating silence in that hotel room, heavy with things that could not be said. Did Van try to apologize? Did Evie try to comfort Keenan? Or did they sit in a paralyzed silence, drinking to numb the absurdity of the situation? Van Johnson, the man whose smile lit up screens across America, was likely vibrating with a cocktail of terror and shame, drinking heavily to drown out the voice in his head that screamed he was a fraud. He was trapping himself in a marriage he didn't want, with a woman he didn't desire, to hide a truth he couldn't accept. Evie, ever the manager, likely spent those hours fixing her makeup and composing her face, transforming herself from the discarded wife into the radiant bride, repressing her own grief to focus on the mission. And Keenan simply waited, a man serving a sentence for a crime he didn't commit, watching the clock tick down to the moment he would officially lose everything. When the 4 hours were up, the bell tolled for the second act of the farce. They returned to the municipal office, but this time the configuration had changed. Van Johnson stepped forward to the desk and Evie stepped up beside him. The ceremony was conducted in Spanish, a language Van barely understood, adding another layer of surrealism to the event. He was pledging his life and his worldly goods to Evie in words that were alien to him, parroting the prompts of the officiant like a bad actor stumbling through a line reading. There were no trembling vows of eternal passion, no tears of joy, only the grim necessity of the contract. When the time came for the ring, Van produced a band, likely purchased by the studio or Evie herself, and slid it onto the finger that had, only hours before, worn Keenan's ring. The symbolism was violent in its directness. One ownership claim was removed, and another was stamped in its place. The studio photographer, brought along to document the evidence, raised his camera, and the flash bulb exploded, capturing the image that would be plastered across newspapers the next day. The twisted family portrait of a smiling Van, a determined Evie, and a hollowed-out Keenan, freezing their lie in silver nitrate forever. The moment the ink dried on the marriage license, the transformation was complete. The Van Johnson that the public knew was saved, but the human being named Charles was buried under the weight of the new persona. They walked out of that office into the blinding Mexican sunlight not as three friends, but as a corporation, Van Johnson Enterprises. The drive back to the border and the subsequent return to Los Angeles was a journey into a new cold reality where the boundaries of their relationships had been permanently redrawn. The relief of having executed the plan was quickly replaced by the dawning horror of the prison they had built. Van was now legally bound to his manager. Evie was the warden of a closeted star. And Keenan was the odd man out, the best friend who would now have to knock on the door of the house he used to own. As the lights of Los Angeles appeared on the horizon, glittering like a sea of diamonds, the publicity machine of MGM was already churning out the press releases, spinning the yarn of a whirlwind romance and undeniable love, preparing to feed the American public the fairy tale they demanded, while the three authors of the fiction rode in silence, knowing that they had just sentenced themselves to a lifetime of performance from which there would be no intermission. The iron gates of the mansion on Copa de Oro Road swung shut behind the newlywed couple, marking the end of the public performance in Mexico and the beginning of a private incarceration that would span 2 decades. To the outside world, peering in through the glossy pages of photoplay and modern screen, the marriage of Van Johnson and Evie Wynn was the ultimate Hollywood fairy tale, a union forged in the fires of friendship and tempered by true love. The fan magazines ran breathless spreads showcasing the domestic bliss of the Johnson family, featuring carefully staged photographs of Van carving the Thanksgiving turkey, Evie arranging flowers in a sunlit parlor, and the couple smiling adoringly over the crib of their daughter, Skylar, who was born in 1948. But to those living inside the sprawling Spanish-style estate, the house was not a home. It was a soundstage where the cameras never stopped rolling, a windowless fortress where the air was perpetually thin and the temperature was always set to freezing. The transition from the bohemian three-way friendship to the rigid structure of a studio-mandated marriage did not bring peace. It brought a suffocating claustrophobia. The moment Evie slipped the ring onto her finger, the dynamic shifted violently. She ceased to be merely the supportive maternal figure who nursed Van back to health after his accident. She became the warden of the most valuable prisoner in Culver City. Evie Johnson understood the assignment with terrifying clarity. She knew that she had not been hired to be a lover. Van had no capacity to offer her that kind of intimacy, but to be a manager, a protector, and a jailer. She attacked the role with the same ruthless efficiency she had applied to Keenan's career, but with far higher stakes. Almost immediately, she took complete control of the machinery of Van's life. She took possession of the checkbook, the calendar, and the Rolodex, establishing a regime where Van Johnson, the man whose face generated millions of dollars for MGM, was placed on a strict allowance like a schoolboy. Evie determined which parties they attended, which scripts he read, and, most crucially, who was allowed to cross the threshold of their home. She began a systematic purge of Van's past, severing his connections to the undesirable friends and associates from his Broadway days and the underground gay scene who might threaten the carefully constructed heterosexual facade. She monitored his phone calls, opened his mail, and policed his interactions, creating a cordon sanitaire around him that was impenetrable. This was not merely possessiveness. It was the desperate calculation of a woman who knew she was sitting on a powder keg. Evie lived in constant terror that Van would slip up, that a drunken indiscretion or a fleeting encounter in a park would bring the entire edifice crashing down, destroying the status and security she had sacrificed her first marriage to attain. For Van, the reality of his salvation was a slow-motion spiritual death. He had traded the terror of exposure for the misery of subjugation. The man-child dynamic that had once drawn him to Evie, his need for a mother figure, her need for a dependent, curdled into something toxic. In the privacy of their home, Van was not the confident, swaggering hero of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. He was the emasculated figure, constantly critiqued and corrected by a wife who treated him less like a husband and more like a delinquent son. The bedroom, The theoretical heart of any marriage became a zone of icy negotiation. They maintained separate rooms, a common practice among the elite, but in their case, the separation was a demilitarized zone. The birth of their daughter, Skylar, was widely viewed by insiders as a studio baby, a necessary production to cement the image of the happy family and quell any lingering rumors. A biological contract fulfilled rather than a fruit of passion. Van loved his daughter, but his capacity to be a father was crippled by his own arrested development. He was more of a playmate than a parent, often competing with his own children for attention, leaving Evie to be the disciplinarian for everyone in the house, a role that hardened her features and soured her soul. Denied the ability to be his authentic self and stripped of his autonomy by his wife manager, Van sought escape through the only avenues left open to him, the bottle and the shadows. The boy next door, with a wholesome grin, developed a dark, jagged edge once the sun went down. Van began to drink heavily, transforming from the charming, eager-to-please star into a sullen, mean drunk who lashed out with petty cruelties. The alcohol was a numbing agent, a way to blur the sharp edges of his reality, but it also loosened the carefully tightened screws of his self-control. There were nights when the frustration boiled over, leading to screaming matches that echoed through the halls of the Bel Air mansion. Vicious circular arguments where Van would rail against his cage and Evie would coldly remind him of who held the keys. Yet even the alcohol was not enough to suppress the fundamental truth of his nature. Despite the marriage, despite the surveillance, despite the risks, Van continued to lead a double life. It became a game of high-stakes Russian roulette. He would slip away from the studio or the house, disappearing into the clandestine gay subculture of Los Angeles, engaging in risky, anonymous encounters in public restrooms, bathhouses, or private parties in the Hollywood Hills. These were not romantic trysts. They were desperate, frantic grasps for human connection and sexual release, performed in the shadow of potential ruin. Every time Van stepped out of the straight character, he risked everything. Howard Strickling and the studio fixers were kept on a constant, low-level alert, forever sweeping up the breadcrumbs of Van's indiscretions, paying off witnesses and intimidating police officers. Evie knew. She had to know. The business trips, the late nights on the set, the unexplained absences. She recognized the signs, but she chose to weaponize them rather than confront them with empathy. She used his guilt as another chain to bind him. Every slip-up by Van was ammunition for Evie, reinforcing her narrative that he was helpless without her, that he was sick, and that she was the only thing standing between him and the gutter. The marriage became a cycle of transgression and punishment, a twisted psychological waltz where they hated each other but could not let go. The most tragic victims of this windowless house were the children, the silent witnesses to the fraudulent domesticity. Ned Wynn, Keenan's son whom Evie had brought into the marriage, and Skylar, the daughter born to the union, grew up in a home that was physically perfect but emotionally sterile. In her later memoirs, Schuyler would describe a childhood that felt like living on a movie set. After the crew had gone home, the props were there, the lighting was perfect, but there was no life. She recalled a father who was distant, often looking through her rather than at her, a man who seemed to be saving all his warmth for the public and bringing only his exhaustion home. She described a mother who was consumed by the management of the brand, a woman so tightly wound that she seemed on the verge of shattering. The children learned early on that the family was a performance. They learned to smile for the photographers on the front lawn, to look adoringly at Daddy when the flashbulbs popped, and then to retreat to their rooms when the silence returned. They saw the separate bedrooms. They heard the muffled arguments. They felt the chill of a house where love was a plot point in a press release, not a daily practice. They watched their father, the world's most beloved man, sit alone in his den with a drink, staring into the middle distance, a prisoner in a castle built of lies. And hovering on the periphery of this domestic tragedy was the ghost of Keenan Wynn. Though legally excised from the family, Keenan remained a spectral presence in their lives. He visited the house sometimes for holidays or parties, playing the role of the good friend that the studio script demanded. But the dynamic was excruciating. To see his best friend living in his house, raising his son, and sleeping, however nominally, with his ex-wife was a daily humiliation. Keenan watched the decay of the marriage from the outside. He saw Van's drinking. He saw Evie's bitterness. He saw that the sacrifice he had made, the destruction of his own family, had not resulted in happiness for anyone. It had only bought success. He saw Van Johnson become a multimillionaire, a legend, a box office titan, while he remained a working actor, and he had to swallow the bile of knowing that Van's success was built on the foundation of Keenan's erasure. The friendship, once the most important relationship in both their lives, had become a scar tissue, tough, unfeeling, and a permanent reminder of the wound. For 20 years, the Johnson marriage endured. It endured not because it was strong, but because the studio system that built it was too powerful to allow it to fail. As long as Louis B. Mayer and the old guard held sway, the facade had to be maintained. Van and Evie were the premier couple of MGM, and their divorce would have been an admission that the studio's manufacturing process was flawed. So they stayed. They stayed through the 1950s as the culture began to shift. They stayed as Van's star began to cool, and the Bobby Soxers grew up and moved on to Elvis Presley. They stayed through the slow, agonizing death of the Golden Age. They lived in their windowless house, playing their parts to an emptying theater, bound together by a contract that had been signed in blood and fear, waiting for the moment when the lights would finally go out and they could stop pretending to be people they were not. But by then, the mask had eaten into the face. They had played the roles for so long that they had forgotten who they were supposed to be without them. The prison had become their only known world, and the tragedy was that even if the doors were unlocked, they no longer knew how to walk out. The end of the 4-hour drama did not coincide with a sudden explosion, but rather with the slow, grinding erosion of the very tectonic plates upon which the marriage had been built. By the mid-1960s, the Hollywood that had engineered the union of Van Johnson and Evie Wynn, the Hollywood of Louis B. Mayer, of ironclad contracts, of moral clauses and fixers who could bribe police chiefs, was crumbling into dust. The studio system, that grand tyrannical machine that had manufactured stars like automobiles on an assembly line, was being dismantled by the rise of television, the antitrust laws, and a cultural revolution that had no patience for the sanitized, manufactured innocence of the boy next door. The gods of the backlot were dead or deposed. Mayer had been ousted from power in 1951 and died in 1957, taking with him the terrifying authority that had once forced 3 people into a room and commanded them to rearrange their lives. Without the external pressure of the studio to hold the artificial structure together, the marriage of Van and Evie was exposed for what it truly was, a business arrangement whose contract had expired. The fear that had once been the binding agent of their lives had evaporated, leaving behind only the jagged residue of resentment. The collapse, when it finally came in the late 1960s, was ugly, bitter, and entirely devoid of the cinematic grace that had characterized Van's career. The catalyst was not a scandal in the tabloids, but the sheer exhausting accumulation of 20 years of mutual hostility. Van Johnson, now in his 50s, his red hair fading and the bobby soxers long gone, found himself a man out of time, trapped in a domestic prison with a woman he had never loved and who had ceased to even pretend to respect him. The man-child finally rebelled against the mother-manager. He began to spend more time away from the fortress on Copa de Oro Road, drifting through dinner theater tours and foreign film productions, putting oceans between himself and Evie's critical gaze. When he finally filed for divorce in 1968, it was the act of a prisoner digging a tunnel with a spoon, a desperate, messy clawing for freedom. Evie did not take the dissolution of the partnership quietly. To her, this was not just a heartbreak. It was a breach of contract, a theft of her life's work. She had sacrificed her first marriage, her reputation, and her youth to construct the Van Johnson entity. She had managed his money, curbed his vices, and kept him out of jail. In her mind, she owned him. She was the architect, and he was merely the building. The divorce proceedings were acrimonious, a scorched earth campaign where Evie fought for every penny, driven by a deep calcified sense of betrayal. She told friends and the press that she had made Van Johnson, that he was nothing without her guidance, a helpless child who would crumble the moment he stepped out of her shadow. The tragedy was that, in a professional sense, she was partially right. Van's career never recovered its former glory without her iron hand. But in a human sense, she was entirely wrong. She believed she had molded a man, but in reality she had only maintained a fiction. When the judge finally banged the gavel, ending the 100-year sentence that had begun in Juarez, the wreckage was total. There were no winners, only survivors staggering away from a crash. Keenan Wynn, the third point of the triangle, watched the disintegration from a distance with a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. He had remarried. He had continued to work steadily as a respected character actor, appearing in classics like Dr. Strangelove, carving out a niche as the gritty, reliable, tough guy, the antithesis of the pretty boy image of Van. But the wound of 1947 never truly healed. He had lost his wife to his best friend, and then he had lost his best friend to the lie they had all agreed to tell. The camaraderie of the early days, the motorcycle rides, the shared dreams, all of it had been sacrificed on the altar of Van's stardom. Keenan lived the rest of his life carrying the invisible scar of that betrayal. A man who had seen the machinery of Hollywood up close and had been chewed up by its gears. He died in 1986, a professional to the end, but a man who, in his quiet moments, must have wondered how different his life would have been if he had just said no in Louis B. Mayer's office. Evie Johnson spent her final years in a state of embittered exile. She had lost the two men who defined her existence. She drifted into obscurity, the queen of Hollywood, without a court. She died in 2004, carrying to her grave the secrets of the arrangement, maintaining to the very end the rigid, proud silence of a woman who believed she had done what was necessary to survive. She never publicly admitted the transactional nature of the marriage. To do so would have been to admit that her entire adult life was a sham. She died a victim of her own ambition, a woman who had successfully managed a star but failed to live a life. And what of Van Johnson? What of the golden boy who was finally free? This is the most heartbreaking chapter of all. Van Johnson lived for another 40 years after the divorce. He lived to be 92 years old, passing away in 2008. He outlived the studio system. He outlived Mayer. He outlived Keenan and Evie. He lived long enough to see the world change completely, to see the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement, the acceptance of homosexuality in mainstream culture. He lived to see a world where an actor like Ian McKellen could be a knight of the realm and openly gay, where Ellen DeGeneres could host talk shows. The prison door was wide open. The guards were dead. The laws had changed. But Van Johnson never walked out. He retreated to a penthouse in New York City, surrounded by his paintings and his memories. A wealthy, eccentric recluse. He never remarried. He never publicly came out. He never wrote a tell-all book. Even when it was safe, even when he had nothing left to lose, the conditioning of the 1940s was too deep. The fear instilled by Louis B. Mayer and Howard Strickling was too permanent. The metal plate in his head from the car accident was a physical reminder of his fragility, but the psychological armor he had built was far stronger. He had played the role of the straight heartthrob for so long that it had fused to his skin. To drop the mask would be to admit that his entire legend was a lie. And Van Johnson, the creation of MGM, could not survive that truth. He spent his final decades in a gilded solitude, a man who was loved by millions of strangers, but truly known by almost no one. He was the last survivor of a shipwreck, floating alone on a raft, refusing to signal for help because he had been taught that silence was the only way to survive. The boy next door died an old man who had never really invited anyone inside. Ultimately, the story of the Copa de Oro household is more than salacious gossip. It remains forensic evidence of a crime against the human spirit. It is a story about the brutality of an industry that treated human beings as raw materials, mining their trauma for profit and discarding the husks. The legacy of Van, Evie, and Keenan is a cautionary tale about the Faustian nature of fame. They wanted the world, the money, the applause, the immortality of the silver screen, and the devil in the form of a studio chief gave it to them. But the price was their authenticity. The price was their ability to love and be loved for who they really were. The surviving photograph from Juarez stands as a haunting testament. The groom's dead eyes, the bride's fierce jaw, and the best friend's hollow stance capture the 20th century American dream in its most toxic form. The belief that if you look perfect, if you smile bright enough, if you follow the script, you will be happy. Van Johnson, Evie Wynn, and Keenan Wynn prove that you can have it all. The fame, the fortune, the legacy, and still end up with absolutely nothing. The screen fades to black, the credits roll, but for them the lights never came back on.